Hi guys, and welcome to another episode of Kabir Considers. In this video, we're going to react to why US Thanksgiving wasn't what I expected. This isn't me, this is from Lawrence of Lost in the Pond. And I'm surprised he would say that because, you know, he's been in America for so long. He must have had a good idea about what Thanksgiving would be before he went to America. But then again, you know, Thanksgiving and Christmas are two completely different celebrations. And when I think of Thanksgiving, I think it's probably like a Christmassy type thing. There's gift giving, there's turkey eating, but there's probably some key differences that you didn't expect.
As somebody who grew up 4,000 miles from my current home, the only frame of reference I had for the American life I now live was American TV and film. In the 80s, much like today, these infiltrated Britain in much the same way British music infiltrated America. As a child, I was in love with the Goonies, not to mention Andy from the Goonies. I watched Back to the Future 47 times in the same week. And then at some point in the late 80s, I was introduced to a very specific American comedy. Now, for context, you have to understand that back then, my dad used to go on business.
Wow, he looks just like his dad. He is literally like a carbon copy.
Dad used to go on business trips to London. And this was always quite exciting because it meant he'd return with a mystery VHS. Following a successful track record of delivering eye-popping entertainment, my dad apparently decided on a different approach with an American movie that I did not recognize.
Planes, Trains and Automobiles, said my very English dad. It's about a bloke who's trying to get home for, I think they call it Thanksgiving.
I think I've
it's meant
seen
to be
this
right
one.
Funny.
Given that I was expecting Karate Kid 2, my disappointment was palpable. And so the tape lay dormant until I was bored one Sunday afternoon. I put it on, and sure enough, my dad was right. It was funny. To the extent that my best friend and I used to copy the bit where Steve Martin says the F word 18 times. Sorry, Mum, if you're just learning about that. But after several watches, there was one question that kept popping into my head. What on earth is Thanksgiving? Well, 20 years later, after moving to the United States, I found out firsthand, and it wasn't what I was expecting. The first surprise is that Thanksgiving wasn't simply another word for Christmas. And I know to Americans that might sound weird because Thanksgiving isn't Christmas.
But that's all we think it is. I mean, because most of us don't know why Thanksgiving is celebrated in America. I kind of know, but it's still kind of unsure in my head.
But the film gave me more than one reason to believe that it was. Firstly, they're driving around in lots of snow, which in Britain is a fairly rare event, but if it does occur, it usually does so in winter and not autumn. I have since realised and was reminded just the other day that in the American Midwest, thick snow in November, or Snowvember, is not uncommon. He loves it, look at him. He's so excited. Are you gonna run around, Arthur? Are you going to run around? Secondly, in the film, while Steve Martin's wife is waiting for him to come home, I believe there's a quick shot of her lighting a candle, which we're not going to do.
That's a candle? I've been sitting here the whole time thinking that was a glass of orange juice.
Right now because there's a cat here and I'll probably burn him. But that, in tandem with this winter feel, made it appear like a cheap Christmas card. Thirdly, Steve Martin's wife pulls from the oven a giant turkey, and that is not a euphemism. Turkey, of course, in Britain is mostly synonymous with the Christmas meal, and so this was a huge reason that I think, for the first 26 years of my life, I thought Thanksgiving on the one hand and Christmas on the other were actually one and the same.
I would actually say most people here don't eat turkey unless it's Christmas. Like, do you eat turkey other than Thanksgiving and Christmas? I should eat it more because it's quite a healthy meat, isn't it?
But it turns out that not only is Thanksgiving not Christmas, it takes place in November. Specifically, the fourth Thursday in November. It didn't help that Steve Martin lived in a huge house in the Chicago suburbs, because that makes me think of one thing: Home Alone, which is a Christmas movie. Anyway, speaking of two films that featured the late great Sir Jonathan Candy, that brings us on to this. I didn't know it yet, but America was not alone in celebrating a holiday of this very name. I mean, cut me some slack, I barely knew that America did. Because as I've been doing this channel over the years, I've discovered that there are Canadians in the world, and they watch. Hello. And usually, whenever I do any kind of Thanksgiving-themed content,
there are Canadians in the world.
I get those really polite comments that are along the lines of, Lawrence, you disgrace. You forgot about Canadian Thanksgiving again.
That's a good-looking
so I'm
turkey.
inserting it into this video
Is that
to
AI?
appease you. John Candy, the greatest Canadian after Bret the Hitman Hart, would not have celebrated Thanksgiving the same day as his character in Planes, Trains and Automobiles, because it turns out that Canada does theirs on the second Monday in October. And given that Canada also does Boxing Day, if you took all of the North American holidays, the holiday season would never end. It would be 3 solid months of eating and vomiting. Before I knew better, I never once questioned the inherent meaning of Thanksgiving.
Yeah,
that we gather
what's
to
the
celebrate
reason?
the birth of our Lord Jesus Christ and open lots of presents. But during my first Thanksgiving party, which happened about 2 weeks after I moved to the United States, it became clear at that point that this was in addition to Christmas. And so I was quickly onto the business of eating, but also asking these friends and family members at the table, what's all this about? And this was actually at a college campus, so for them it was about getting drunk. But, you know, after a few solid pints, I managed to get out of them that the day is all about giving thanks. The clue is in the name. It's about giving thanks for this bountiful harvest of food that we have at this table, or just in America. I'm not going to do a deep dive on the history of this, but what I am going to do is just give you my observation of how Americans display that gratitude. I don't think I've been to a single Thanksgiving family meal with her family and not sat there while another family member, usually a bloke, I don't know why that is, says, let's say grace. So I do. Grace. And at that point, everybody in the room looks at me and says, shut up, you clown. And they, you know, basically thank the Lord for all of this wonderful food that we are about to eat to excess. But I think it's more than that, because I think that something that I suppose we never got to see in Planes, Trains and Automobiles is the actual event, the sitting round the table, because Thanksgiving is a joyous occasion. And I don't know that that's just because people feel extra thankful that day, or if it's this. It's a holiday with very little pressure, unless you're the one cooking all the food.
Is gift giving a thing on Thanksgiving? Because Black Friday and Cyber Monday, they're all sort of near Thanksgiving. Like, is it just a coincidence that they're close together, or did Black Friday become a thing because people were buying gifts to give each other on the day?
Then there's a lot of pressure. But unlike Christmas, you don't have to buy presents for anybody.
Okay,
so that's
you
nice.
don't have to.
And because it falls on a Thursday, some employers might even give their employees the Friday off, so therefore you get a 4-day weekend, which is a bloody rare thing in America. In Britain, this exact scenario plays out if indeed Christmas and Boxing Day are immediately before or immediately after the weekend. In either case, in my experience, you'll probably spend those 4 days eating turkey sandwiches.
And while we're on the subject of meat, a YouTube sensation like me needs all the fuel he can get for creating the second best videos on the internet. That's why I'm using today's sponsor, Good Chop Boxes.
The basic
Planes and
premise of
frequent
Planes,
trains.
Trains and Automobiles is, of course, a send-up of actual US travel patterns around Thanksgiving. According to AAA, around 80 million Americans travel at least 50 miles at this time of year. And routinely, I'm one of them. I suppose that's what happens when you start your American life in Indiana and then move to Chicago and leave behind a lot of family members that you inherited. Well, this kind of thing, I've come to find, is the reality for a lot of Americans. And so, like Steve Martin's character, they might use all manner of transport to try to get where they need to go. Now, admittedly, most of the time, we will drive those hundreds of miles in a car. But one time, when we were less rich, we used Megabus. And there was something profoundly
Megabus. I used to use that to get to uni.
disappointing about that. It's that the people on the bus didn't start singing the theme tune to the Flintstones, which happens in Planes, Trains and Automobiles.
Flintstones, meet the Flintstones.
Now, in hindsight, this is sort of weird because if anyone's going to break out into song, it is Americans. I pointed out in my recent road trip video that this is a fairly common occurrence with inside the walls of a car. Do cars have walls? I don't know. But in my experience, this sort of thing doesn't happen on buses. Largely because nobody wants to be there and we're all terrified of strangers. Happy holidays. But when it comes to travelling for the holidays, I think Planes, Trains and Automobiles did get one thing right. And that's that American trains are unreliable.
Yeah, why isn't there like a proper interstate train network in America? Like, I would have thought you guys would be sort of the number one at this thing, but I don't think it exists, does it?
What I'm about to say is a spoiler for a 37-year-old film. So if you haven't seen Planes, Trains and Automobiles, put me on mute for 20 seconds and don't be tempted to lip read. At the end of the movie, Steve Martin takes a lonely John Candy back to his huge house in the Chicago suburb.
Is that the same house as the Home Alone house? It looks very similar, doesn't it?
And when they get there, the family is so happy to see them. Paul Young is playing in the background, and it's just a rousing finish to the film. There's just one problem. Where are the other 20 people, Steve? I mean, I know you turned up late, so maybe they all left. But my experience is if you've got a house as big as that, you'll have cousins, second cousins, some guy named Todd that nobody recognises. Because Americans, much more than the British, like to go all out when it comes to invitations. On the one hand, it can be overwhelming for introverts such as myself. On the other, it does give me more people to turn to when my wife's cousin Chad tries to get me to look at his comic collection. Had I known the full extent of a Thanksgiving meal, I might have overcome my Christmas confusion much sooner. For it seems to me that Steve Martin's wife's turkey, again, not a euphemism, was in fact a ruse. Because when you take into account some of the other food items that are common at a Thanksgiving dinner table, there's not really a lot of crossover with British Christmas at all. Firstly, there's no Christmas pudding, obviously, and instead of mince pies, you have one of either pecan pie, my favourite,
So that's what a pecan pie looks like from the top. Interesting.
pumpkin pie made out of real pumpkins and not whatever the hell this travesty is from Target, or sweet potato pie, or about 100 other pies. And sure, as I told YouTube sensation Evan Edinger the other day, you know, I gave up added sugar, I'm not going to eat this with you. But back when I wasn't, pies contribute heavily to making this my favourite of the American holidays. And then there's the sides. I remember sitting around a table not dissimilar to
What kind of egg was that? Looked like the yolk had been taken out and mixed with
this,
something.
and my wife said, I want stuffing, which left me mortified until I realised she meant the food. And so I passed her stuffing, to which she said, that's not stuffing, that's oyster dressing. The stuffing is on the far side of the table. Well, they look the same to me. What is this? I've never heard of oyster dressing.
Well, it turns out I should have. Oyster dressing, a bread-filled dish typically enjoyed in the South and by at least one family in the Midwest, actually originated in Britain. The first known
Oyster
reference to oyster
dressing.
dressing can be found in a 1685 edition of The Accomplished, a cookery book by the English chef Robert May.
Is it me or is he looking in two directions?
Anyway, the recipe, then a mixture of oysters, bacon, herbs and spices, was brought to North America by British colonists, first showing up in American print more than a century later in Amelia Simmons' American Cookery.
Suffice to say, the stuffing or dressing that I've had in the United States is usually quite a lot different to the stuffing that I had in Britain. Partly that comes down to texture, but secondarily, it comes down to the shape. Back in Britain, where I come from, it was not uncommon to have stuffing balls, which that is a euphemism.
However, in the US, stuffing is often not as congealed, a sort of
Keep it PG, Lawrence.
heavy free-for-all inside a casserole dish, themselves more prevalent in US kitchens than British ones.
I'm probably generalising heavily with everything I've said in this video, but for the most part, that's been my experience.
Oh, it's funny how life works out. 35 years after I first laid eyes on planes, trains and automobiles, I've come to appreciate it on a level my childhood brain couldn't have comprehended. Not only have the things listed in this video become annually ingrained into my life, but as fate would have it, I too now live in a suburb of Chicago. It's just that my house is marginally smaller than Steve Martin's.
I really cannot wait to experience my first Thanksgiving dinner, proper Thanksgiving dinner. I want to do it in America, you know, with a family or something, people that really do it properly, just to sort of feel what it's like, because it does. You know, I like the idea of, you know, giving thanks and things like that. I think it's a cool thing to do, and we just don't celebrate it here. It's not mentioned here, and I suppose because it's not a British thing, why would we mention it here? The closest thing we do to Thanksgiving is I remember when I was a kid, the teachers would tell us all to bring in something from home, a food item that we would donate to a charity. I think we would do it around Easter time, but yeah, so completely different time of the year, but it was a similar sort of giving thanks type thing. But yeah, I really want to experience Thanksgiving. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.